Talk. The Ionian Islands. 1858 to 1859. The world is now taking an immense interest in Greek affairs, and does not seem to know why. But there are very good reasons for it. Greece is a center of life, and the only possible center for the archipelago and its immediate neighborhood. But it is vain to think of it as a center from which light and warmth can proceed, until it has attained to a tolerable organization, political and economical. I believe in the capacity of the people to receive the boon. Gladstone, 1862. Proposal from Bulwer. At the beginning of October, while on a visit to Lord Aberdeen at Haddo, Mr. Gladstone was amazed by a letter from the Secretary of State for the Colonies, one of the two famous writers of romance then in Lord Derby's cabinet, which opened to him the question of undertaking a special mission to the Ionian Islands. This, said Bulwer Lytton, would be to render to the Crown a service that no other could do so well, and that might not inharmoniously blend with his general fame as scholar and statesman. To reconcile a race that speaks the Greek language to the science of practical liberty seemed to me a task that might be a noble episode in your career. The origin of an invitation so singular is explained by Phillimore. November 2, 1858. Lord Carnarvon, then Under-Secretary at the Colonial Office, sent an earnest letter to me to come to the CO and advise with Rogers and himself as to drawing the commission. I met Bulwer Lytton there, overflowing with civility. The offer to Gladstone had arisen as I expected from Lord C, and he had told B.L. the conversation which he is C, and I had together in the summer, in which I told Lord C that I thought Gladstone would accept a mission extraordinary to Naples. I risked without authority from G this communication. Lord C bore it in mind, and from this suggestion of mine sprang in fact this offer. So Lord C said to me. Lord Malmesbury very sensibly observed that to send Mr. Gladstone to Naples was out of the question, in view of his famous letters to Lord Aberdeen. To the new proposal Mr. Gladstone replied that his first impulse on any call from a minister of the Crown to see him on public business would be to place himself at the minister's disposal. The interview did not occur for a week or two. Papers were sent from the Colonial Office to Hardin, long letters followed from the Secretary of State, and Mr. Gladstone took time to consider. The constitution of the Ionian Islands had long been working uneasily, and what the Colonial Secretary invited him to undertake was an inquiry on the spot into our relations there, and into long-standing embarrassments that seemed to be rapidly coming to a head. Sir John Young, then Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian Islands, had been with him at Eton and at Oxford, besides being a Peelite colleague in Parliament, and Mr. Gladstone was not inclined to be the instrument of indicating disparagement of his friend. Then, moreover, he was in favor of a very liberal policy in regard to the Ionian Islands, and possibly the cabinet did not agree to a very liberal policy. As for personal interest and convenience, he was not disposed to raise any difficulty in such a case. The Peelite colleagues whose advice he sought were all, with the single exception of the Duke of Newcastle, more or less unconditionally adverse. Lord Aberdeen, October 8, admitted that Mr. Gladstone's name, acquirements, and conciliatory character might operate powerfully on the Ionians, still many of them were false and artful, and the best of them little better than children. It is clear, he said, that Bulwer has sought to allure you with vague declarations and the attractions of Homeric propensities. I doubt if Homer will be a cheval de bataille sufficiently strong to carry you safely through the intricacies of this enterprise. The sagacious Graham also warned him that little credit would be gained by success, while failure would be attended by serious inconveniences. In any case, to quell a storm in a teapot was no occupation worthy of his powers and position. Sidney Herbert was strong that governments were getting more and more into the bad habit of delegating their own business to other people. He doubted success, and expressed his hearty wish that we could be quit of the protectorate altogether, and could hand the islands bodily over to Greece, to which by blood, language, religion, and geography they belonged. I have said that these adverse views were almost unqualified, and such qualification as existed was rather remarkable. The only part of the affair I should regard with real pleasure, wrote Lord Aberdeen, would be the means it might afford you of drawing closer to the government, and of naturally establishing yourself in a more suitable position, for in spite of Homer and Ulysses, your Ionian work will by no means be tanty in itself. Graham took the same point. An approximation to the government may be fairly sought or admitted by you. But this should take place on higher grounds. Thus, though he was now in fact unconsciously on the eve of his formal entry into a Liberal cabinet, expectations still survived that he might rejoin his old party. As might have been expected, the wanderings of Ulysses and the geography of Homer prevailed in Mr. Gladstone's mind over the counsels of parliamentary Nestors. Besides the ancient heroes, there was the fascination of the Orthodox Church, so peculiar and so irresistible for the Anglican school to which Mr. Gladstone belonged. Nor must we leave out of account the passion for public business so often allied with the student's temperament, the desire of the politician out of work for something definite to do, Mr. Gladstone's keen relish at all times for any foreign travel that came in his way, finally, and perhaps strongest of all, the fact that his wife's health had been much shaken by the death of her sister, Lady Littleton, and the doctors were advising change of scene, novel interests, and a southern climate. His decision was very early a foregone conclusion. So his doubting friends could only wish him good fortune. Graham said, "If your hand be destined to lay the foundation of a Greek empire on the ruins of the Ottoman, no hand can be more worthy, no work more glorious. Recidiva manu paguisum Pergama was a noble aspiration. Wink with a frown. 375. With you it may be realized." Mission accepted. He hastened to enlist the services as secretary to his commission of Mr. Lakita, whose friendship he had first made 7 years before, as we have seen, amid the sinister tribunals and squalid dungeons of Naples. For dealings with the Greco-Italian population of the islands he seemed the very man. As regards Greek, Mr. Gladstone wrote to him, "You are one of the few persons to whom one gives credit for knowing everything, and I assumed on this ground that you had a knowledge of ancient Greek, such as would enable you easily to acquire the kind of acquaintance with the modern form, such as is, I presume, desirable. That is my own predicament, with the additional disadvantage of our barbarous English pronunciation." Accompanied by Mrs. Gladstone and their eldest daughter, and with Mr. Arthur Gordon, the son of Lord Aberdeen, and now, after long service to the state, known as Lord Stanmore, for private secretary, Mr. Gladstone left England on November 8, 1858, and he returned to it on the 8th of March, 1859. 2. The Ionian Case. The Ionian case was this. By a treaty made at Paris in November 1815, between Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, the 7 islands, scattered along the coast from Meperos to the extreme south of the Morea, were constituted into a single free and independent state under the name of the United States of the Ionian Islands, and this state was placed under the immediate and exclusive protection of Great Britain. The powers only thought of keeping the islands out of more dubious hands, and cared little or not at all about conferring any advantage upon either us or the Ionians. The states were to regulate their own internal organization, and Great Britain was to employ a particular solicitude with regard to the legislation and general administration of those states, and was to appoint a Lord High Commissioner to reside there with all necessary powers and authorities. The Duke of Wellington foretold that it would prove a tough and unprofitable job, and so in truth it did. A constitutional charter in 1817 formed a system of government that soon became despotic enough to satisfy Metternich himself. The scheme has been justly described as a singularly clever piece of work, appearing to give much while in fact giving nothing at all. It contained a decorous collection of chapters, sections, and articles imposing enough in their outer aspect, but in actual operation the whole of them reducible to a single clause enabling the High Commissioner to do whatever he pleased. This rough but not ill-natured despotism lasted for little more than 30 years, and then in 1849, under the influence of the great upheaval of 1848, it was changed into a system of more popular and democratic build. The old Venetians, when for a couple of centuries they were masters in this region, laid it down that the islanders must be kept with their teeth drawn and their claws clipped. "Bread and the stick," said Father Paul, "that is what they want." This view prevailed at the Colonial Office, and maxims of Father Paul Serpy's sort, incongruously combined with a paper constitution, worked as ill as possible. Mr. Gladstone always applied to the new system of 1849 Charles Buller's figure, of first lighting the fire and then stopping up the chimney. The stick may be wholesome, and local self-government may be wholesome, but in combination or rapid alternation they are apt to work nothing but mischief either in Ionian or any other islands. Sir Charles Napier, the Napier of Sind, who had been resident in Cephalonia 30 years before, in Byron's closing days, describes the richer classes as lively and agreeable, the women as having both beauty and wit, but of little education, the poor as hardy, industrious, and intelligent, all full of pleasant humor and vivacity, with a striking resemblance, says Napier, to his countrymen, the Irish. The upper class was mainly Italian in origin, and willingly threw all the responsibility for affairs on the British government. The official class, more numerous in proportion to population than in any country in Europe, scrambled for the petty salaries of paltry posts allotted by popular election. Since 1849 they had increased by 25%, and were now 1 in 100 of the inhabitants. The clergy in a passive way took part with the demagogues. Men of ability and sense were not wanting, but being unorganized, discouraged, and saturated with distrust, they made no effort to stem the jobbery, corruption, waste, going on around them. Roads, piers, aqueducts, and other monuments of the British Protectorate reared before 1849 were falling to pieces. Taxes were indifferently collected. Transgressors of local law went unpunished. In 10 years the deficit in the revenue had amounted to nearly £100,000, or 2/3 of a year's income. The cultivators of the soil figured in official reports as naturally well affected, and only wishing to grow their currants and their olives in peace and quietness. But they were extremely poor, and they were ignorant and superstitious, and being all these things it was inevitable that they should nurse discontent with their government. Whoever wanted their votes knew that the way to get them was to denounce the Englishman as to epsilon rho delta omicron xi omicron kappa alpha xino omicron, heretic, alien, and tyrant. There was a Senate of 6 members, chosen by the High Commissioner from the Assembly. The 42 members of the Assembly met below galleries that held 1,000 persons, and nothing made their seats and salaries so safe as round declamations from the floor to the audience above, on the greatness of the Hellenic race and the need for union with the Greek kingdom. The municipal officer in charge of education used to set as a copy for the children, a prayer that Pan-Hellenic concord might drive the Turks out of Greece and the English out of the 7 islands. Cephalonia exceeded the rest of the group both in population and in vehemence of character, while Zante came first of all in the industry and liveliness of its people, 376. These 2 islands were the main scene and source of difficulty. In Cephalonia 9 years before the date with which we are now dealing, an agrarian rising had occurred more like a bad white boy outrage than a national rebellion, and it was suppressed with cruel rigor by the High Commissioner of the day. 22 people had been hanged, 300 or more had been flogged, most of them without any species of judicial investigation. The fire-raisings and destruction of houses and vineyards were of a fierce brutality to match. These Ionian atrocities were the proceedings with which Prince Schwarzenberg had taunted Lord Aberdeen by way of rejoinder to Mr. Gladstone's letters on barbarous misgovernment in Naples, and the feelings that they had roused were still smouldering. Half a dozen newspapers existed, all of them vehemently and irreconcilably unionist, though all controlled by members of the Legislative Assembly who had taken an oath at the beginning of each parliament to respect and maintain the constitutional rights of the protecting sovereign. The liberty of unlicensed printing, however, had been subject to a pretty stringent check. By virtue of what was styled a power of high police, the Lord High Commissioner was able at his own will and pleasure to tear away from home, occupation, and livelihood anybody that he chose, and the high police found its commonest objects in the editors of newspapers. An obnoxious leading article was not infrequently followed by deportation to some small and barren rock, inhabited by a handful of fishermen. Not cherubim and seraphim, said Mr. Gladstone, could work such a system. A British corporal with all the patronage in his hands, said another observer, would get on better than the greatest and wisest statesman since Pericles, if he had not the patronage. It was little wonder that a distracted Lord High Commissioner, to adopt the similes of the florid Secretary of State, should one day send home a picture like Salvatore's Massacre of the Innocents, or Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and the next day recall the swains of Albano at repose and the landscapes of Claude, should one day advise his chiefs to wash their hands of the Ionians, and on the morrow should hint that perhaps the best thing would be by a bold coup d'état to sweep away the Constitution. 377. 3. The Stolen Dispatch. Immediately after Mr. Gladstone had started, what the Secretary of State described as the most serious misfortune conceivable happened. A dispatch was stolen from the pigeonholes of the Colonial Office, and a morning paper printed it. It had been written home some 18 months before by Sir John Young, and in it he advised his government, with the assent of the contracting powers, to hand over either the whole of the 7 islands to Greece, or else at least the 5 southern islands, while transforming Corfu and its little satellite of Paxo into a British colony. It was true that a few days later he had written a private letter, wholly withdrawing this advice and substituting for it the exact opposite, the suppression namely of such freedom as the islanders possessed. This second fact the public did not know, nor would the knowledge of it have made any difference. The published dispatch stood on record, and say what they would, the startling impression could not be effaced. Well might Lytton call it an inconceivable misfortune. It made Austria uneasy, it perturbed France, and it irritated Russia, all of them seeing in Mr. Gladstone's mission a first step towards the policy recommended in the dispatch. In the breasts of the islanders it kindled intense excitement, and diversified a chronic disorder by a sharp access of fever. It made Young's position desperate, though he was slow to see it, and practically it brought the business of the High Commissioner Extraordinary to naught before it had even begun. He learned the disaster, for disaster it was, at Vienna, and appears to have faced it with the same rigorous firmness and self-command that some of us have beheld at untoward moments long after. The ambassador told him that he ought to see the Austrian minister. With Count Boll he had a long interview accordingly, and assured him that his mission had no concern with any question of Ionian annexation whether partial or total. Count Boll on his part disclaimed all aggressive tendencies in respect of Turkey, and stated emphatically that the views and conduct of Austria in her eastern policy were in the strictest sense conservative. Embarking at Trieste on the warship Terrible, November 21, and after a delightful voyage down the Adriatic, 5 days after leaving Vienna, November 24, Mr. Gladstone found himself at Corfu, the famous island of which he had read such memorable things in Thucydides and Xenophon, the harbor where the Athenians had fitted out the expedition to Syracuse, so disastrous to Greek democracy, where the young Octavian had rallied his fleet before the Battle of Actium, so critical for the foundation of the Empire of the Caesars, and whence Don John had sallied forth for the victory of Lepanto, so fatal to the conquering might of the Ottoman Turks. It was from Corfu that the brothers Bandiera had started on their tragic enterprise for the deliverance of Italy 14 years before. Mr. Gladstone landed under a salute of 17 guns, and was received with all ceremony and honor by the Lord High Commissioner and his officers. Arrival at Corfu. He was not long in discovering what mischief the stolen dispatch had done, and may well have suspected from the first in his inner mind that his efforts to undo it would bear little fruit. The morning after his arrival the 10 members for Corfu came to him in a body with a petition to the Queen denouncing the plan of making their island a British colony, and praying for union with Greece. The municipality followed suit in the evening. The whole sequel was in keeping. Mr. Gladstone with Young's approval made a speech to the Senate, in which he threw over the dispatch, severed his mission wholly from any purpose or object in the way of annexation, and dwelt much upon a circular addressed by the Foreign Office in London to all its ministers abroad disclaiming any designs of that kind. He held levees, he called upon the Archbishop, he received senators and representatives, and everywhere he held the same emphatic language. He soon saw enough to convince him of the harm done to British credit and influence by the severities in Cephalonia, by the small regard and frequent contempt shown by many Englishmen for the religion of the people for whose government they were responsible, by the diatribes in the London press against the Ionians as brigands, pirates, and barbarians, and by the absence in high commissioners and others of tact, good sense, and good feeling in the sense in which it is least common in England. The sense namely in which it includes a disposition to enter into and up to a certain point sympathize with those who differ with us in race, language, and creed. Perhaps his penetrating eye early discovered to him that 40 years of bad rule had so embittered feeling, that even without the stolen dispatch, he had little chance. He made a cruise round the islands. His visit shook him a good deal with respect to two of the points, Corfu and Ithaca, on which it has been customary to dwell as proving Homer's precise local knowledge. The rain poured in torrents for most of the time, but it cleared up for a space to reveal the loveliness of Ithaca. In the island of Ulysses and Penelope he danced at a ball given in his honor. In Cephalonia he was received by a tumultuous mob of 1,000 persons, whom neither the drenching rains nor the unexpected manner of his approach across the hills could baffle. They greeted him with incessant cries for union with Greece, thrust disaffected papers into his carriage, and here and there indulged in cries of Capito Omega Pyro Omicron Sigma Tau Alpha Sigma Alpha, down with the Protectorate, down with the tyranny of 50 years. This exceptional disrespect he ascribed to what he leniently called the history of Cephalonia, meaning the savage dose of martial law 9 years before. He justly took it for a marked symbol of the state of excitement at which under various influences the popular mind had arrived. Age and infirmity prevented the Archbishop from coming to offer his respects, so after his levee Mr. Gladstone with his suite repaired to the Archbishop. "We found him," says Mr. Gordon, "seated on a sofa dressed in his most gorgeous robes of gold and purple, over which flowed down a long white beard. Behind him stood a little court of black-robed, black-bearded, black-capped, dark-faced priests. He is 86 years old, and his manners and appearance were dignified in the extreme." Speaking slowly and distinctly he began to tell Gladstone that the sole wish of Cephalonia was to be united to Greece, and there was something very exciting and affecting in the tremulous tones of the old man saying over and over again, "Questa infalis isola, questa isola infalis," as the tears streamed down his cheeks and long silvery beard. It was like a scene in a play. At Zante, December 15, the surface was smoother. A concourse of several thousands awaited him, Greek flags were flying on all sides in the strong morning sea breeze, the town bands played Greek national tunes, the bells were all ringing, the harbor was covered with boats full of gaily dressed people, and the air resounded with loud shouts Zeta to Omega Phi Iota Lambda 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 Eta Nu Gamma Lambda Delta Sigma Tau Omega Nu. Zeta to Omega Nu Omega Sigma Iota Mu Epsilon Tau Tau Lambda Lambda Alpha Delta Omicron, long live Gladstone the Philhellene, hurrah for union with Greece. Every room and passage in the Residency, Mr. Gordon writes to Lord Aberdeen, was already thronged. Upstairs the excitement was great, and as soon as Gladstone had taken his place, in swept Gerasimus the bishop, followed by scores of swarthy priests in their picturesque black robes, and tendered to him the petition for union. But before he could deliver it, Gladstone stopped him and addressed to him and to the assembly a speech in excellent Italian. Never did I hear his beautiful voice ring out more clear or more thrillingly than when he said, "Ecco l'inganno." It was a scene not to be forgotten. The priests, with eye and hand and gesture, expressed in lively pantomime to each other the effect produced by each sentence, in what we should think a most exaggerated way, like a chorus on the stage, but the effect was most picturesque. Visits Athens. He attended a banquet one night, went to the theatre the next, where he was greeted with lusty Zetos, and at midnight embarked on the Terrible on his way to Athens. His stay in the immortal city only lasted for 3 or 4 days, and I find no record of his impressions. They were probably those of most travelers educated enough to feel the spell of the violet crown. Illusions as to the eternal summer with which poets have blessed the isles of Greece vanished as they found deep snow in the streets, icicles on the Acropolis, and snowballing in the Parthenon. He had a reception only a shade less cordial than if he were Demosthenes come back. He dined with King Otho, and went to a Te Deum in honor of the Queen's birthday. Finlay, the learned man who had more of the true spirit of history than most historians then alive, took him to a meeting of the legislature. He beheld some of the survivors of the War of Independence, and made friends with one valiant lover of freedom, the veteran General Church. Though, thanks to the generosity of an Englishman, they had a university of their own at Corfu, the Ionians preferred to send their sons to Athens, and the Athenian students immediately presented a memorial to Mr. Gladstone with the usual prayer for union with the Hellenic kingdom. On the special object of his visit, he came away from Athens with the impression that opinion in Greece was much divided on the question of immediate union with the Ionian Islands. In truth, his position had been a false one. Everybody was profoundly deferential, but nobody was quite sure whether he had come to pave the way for union, or to invite the Athenian government to check it, and when Rangabe, the foreign minister, found him without credentials or instructions, and staved off all discussion, Mr. Gladstone must have felt that though he had seen one of the 2 or 3 most wondrous historic sites on the globe, that was all. In Albania. Of a jaunt to wilder scenes a letter of Mr. Arthur Gordon's gives a pleasant glimpse. You will like an account of an expedition the whole party made yesterday to Albania to pay a visit to an old lady, a great proprietress, who lives in a large ruinous castle at a place called Philates. She is about the greatest personage in these regions, and it was thought that the Lord High Commissioner should pay her a visit if he wished to see Albania. It was a lovely morning, and breakfast was laid on the balcony of the private apartments looking over the garden and commanding the loveliest of views across the strait. Gladstone was in the highest spirits, full of talk and romping boyishly. After breakfast the LHC's barge and the cutters of the Terrible conveyed us on board the pretty little gunboat. We reached Saida in about 2 hours, and were received on landing by the governor of the province, who had ridden down from Philates to meet us. We went to the house of the English vice-consul, whilst the long train of horses was preparing to start, but after a few minutes' stay there Gladstone became irrepressibly restless, and insisted on setting off to walk. I of course walked too. The old steward also went with us, and a guard of 8 white-kilted palikari on foot. The rest of the party rode, and from a slight hill which we soon reached, it was very pretty to look back at the long procession starting from Saida and proceeding along the narrow causeway running parallel to our path, the figures silhouetted against the sea. Philates is about 12 miles from Saida, perhaps more. The path is rugged and mountainous, and commands some fine views. Our palikari guards fired off their long Afghan-looking guns in every direction, greatly to Gladstone's annoyance, but there was no stopping them. Scouts on the hills gave warning of our approach, and at the entrance to Philates we were met by the whole population. First the Valadea's retainers, then the elders, then the mullahs in their great green turbans, the Christian community, and finally, on the top of the hill, the Valadea's little grandson, gorgeously dressed, and attended by his tutor and a number of black slaves. The little boy salaamed to Gladstone with much grace and self-possession, and then conducted us to the castle, in front of which all the townsfolk who were not engaged in receiving us were congregated in picturesque groups on the smooth grassy lawns and under the great plane trees. The castle is a large ruinous enclosure of walls and towers, with buildings of all sorts and ages within. The Valadea herself, attired in green silk and a fur pelisse, her train held by 2 Negro female slaves, received us at the head of the stairs and ushered us into a large room with a divan round 3 sides of it. Sweetmeats and water and pipes and coffee were brought as usual, some of the cups and their filigree stands very handsome. We went out to see the town, preceded by a tall black slave in a gorgeous blue velvet jacket, with a great silver stick in his hand. Under his guidance we visited the khans, the bazaar, and the mosque. Not only were we allowed to enter the mosque with our shoes on, but on Gladstone expressing a wish to hear the call to prayer, the muezzin was sent up to the top of the minaret to call the azan 2 hours before the proper time. The sight of the green-turbaned imam crying the azan for a franc was most singular, and the endless variety of costume displayed by the crowds who thronged the verandas which surround the mosque was most picturesque. The gateway of the castle, too, was a picturesque scene. Retainers and guards, slaves and soldiers, and even women, were lounging about, and a beautiful tame little pet roetter played with the pretty children in bright-colored dresses, clustering under the cavernous archway. We had dinner in another large room. I counted 32 dishes, or I may say courses, for each dish at a Turkish dinner is brought in separately, and it is rude not to eat of all. The most picturesque part of the dinner, and most unusual, was the way the room was lighted. 8 tall, grand Albanians stood like statues behind us, each holding a candle. It reminded me of the torchbearers who won the laird his bet in the legend of Montrose. After dinner there was a long and somewhat tedious interval of smoking and storytelling in the dark, and we called upon Lacaita to recite Italian poetry, which he did with much effect, pouring out sonnet after sonnet of Petrarch, including that which my father thinks the most beautiful in the Italian language, that which has in it the Campeggiare dell'Angelico Riso. This showed me how easy it was to fall into the habits of a country. Gladstone is as unoriental as any man well can be, yet his calling on Lacaita to recite was really just the same thing that every pasha does after dinner, when he orders his tale-teller to repeat a story. The ladies meanwhile were packed off to the harem for the night, Lady Bowen acting as their interpreter. My LHC, his 2 secretaries, his 3 aides-de-camp, Captains Blomfield and Clanricarde, and the vice-consul, all slept in the same room, and that not a large one, and we were packed tight on the floor, under quilts of Brussa silk and gold, tucked up round us by gorgeous Albanians. Gladstone amused himself with speculating whether or no we were in contravention of the provisions of Lord Shaftesbury's Lodging-House Act. After a month of cloudless sunshine it took it into its head to rain this night of all nights in the year, and rain as it only does in these regions. Gladstone and I walked down again despite of wind, rain, and mud, and our Palikari guard, to keep up their spirits, I suppose, chanted wild choruses all the way. We nearly got stuck altogether in the muddy flat near Sayada, and got on board the Osprey wet through, my hands so chilled I could hardly steer the boat. Of course we had far outwalked the riding party, so we had to wait. What a breakfast we ate! That is, those of us who could eat, for the passage was rough in Gladstone and the ladies flat on their backs and very sorry for themselves. Mr. Gladstone's comment in his diary is brief, the whole impression is saddening, it is all indolence, decay, stagnation, the image of God seems as if it were nowhere. But there is much of wild and picturesque. The English in the island, both civil and military, adopted the tone of unfriendly journals in London, and the garrison went so far as not even to invite Mr. Gladstone to mess, a compliment never omitted before. The Ionians, on the other hand, like people in most other badly governed countries, did not show in the noblest colors. There were petitions, letters, memorials, as to which Mr. Gladstone mildly notes that he has to lament a spirit of exaggeration and obvious errors of fact. There was a stream of demands from hosts of Spiridiones, Christogelos, Euphrosynes, for government employ, and the memorial survives, attested by bishop and clergy, of a man with a daughter to marry, who being too poor to find a dowry had decided on reverting to Your Excellency's well-known Philhellenism, and with tears in his eyes besought that Your Excellency, etc. Correspondence with Bulwer. One incident was much disliked at home, as having the fearsome flavor of the Puseyite. It had been customary at levees for the Lord High Commissioner to bow to everybody, but also to shake hands with the bishops and sundry other high persons. Mr. Gladstone stooped and actually kissed the bishop's hand. Sir Edward Lytton inquired if the story were true, as a question might be asked in Parliament. "It is true," said Mr. Gladstone, February 7, "but I hope Sir E.L. will not in his consideration for me entangle himself in such a matter, but as he knows nothing now, will continue to know nothing, and will say that the subject did not enter into his instructions, and that he presumes I shall be at home in 2 or 3 more weeks to answer for all my misdeeds." 378. The Secretary of State and his potent emissary, the Radical who had turned Tory and the Tory who was on the verge of formally turning Liberal, got on excellently together. Though he was not exact in business, the minister's dispatches and letters show shrewdness, good sense, and right feeling, with a copious garnish of flummery. "Demagogy," he says to Mr. Gladstone, "will continue to be a trade and the most fascinating of all trades, because animated by personal vanity, and its venality disguised even to the demagogue himself by the love of country, by which it may be really accompanied. The Ionian constitution should certainly be mended, for my convictions tell me that there is nothing so impracticable as the unreal." He comforts his commissioner by the reminder that a population after all has one great human heart, and a great human heart is that which chiefly exalts the man of genius over the mere man of talent, so that when a man of genius with practical experience of the principles of sound government comes face to face with a people whose interest it is to be governed well, the chances are that they will understand each other. 4. Mr. Gladstone applied himself with the utmost gravity to the affairs of a pygmy state with a total population under 250,000. His imagination did its work. "While you seem," he said most truly, "to be dealing only with a few specks scarcely visible on the map of Europe, you are engaged in solving a problem as delicate and difficult as if it arose on a far more conspicuous stage." The people he found to be eminently gifted by nature with that subtlety which is apt to degenerate into sophistry, and prone to be both rather light-minded and extremely suspicious. The permanent officials in Downing Street, with less polite analysis, had been accustomed to regard the islanders more bluntly as a pack of scamps. This was what had done the mischief. The material condition of the cultivators was in some respects not bad, but Mr. Gladstone laid down a profound and solid principle when he said that no method of dealing with a civilized community can be satisfactory which does not make provision for its political action as well as its social state. 379. The idea of political reform had for a time made head against the idea of union with the Greek kingdom, but for some years past the whole stream of popular tendency and feeling set strongly towards union, and disdained contentment with anything else. Mankind turned naturally to the solutions that seemed the simplest. Mr. Gladstone condemned the existing system as bad for us and bad for them. Circumstances made it impossible for him to suggest amendment by throwing the burden bodily off our shoulders, and at that time he undoubtedly regarded union with Greece as in itself undesirable for the Ionians. Circumstances and his own love of freedom made it equally impossible to recommend the violent suppression of the Constitution. The only course left open was to turn the mockery of free government into a reality, and this operation he proposed to carry out with a bold hand. The details of this enlargement of popular rights and privileges, and the accompanying financial purgation, do not now concern us. Whether the case either demanded or permitted originality in the way of construction I need not discuss. The manufacture of a constitution is always the easiest thing in the world. The question is whether the people concerned will work it, and in spite of that buoyant optimism which never in any circumstances deserted him in respect of whatever business he might have in hand, Mr. Gladstone must have doubted whether his islanders would ever pretend to accept what they did not seek, as a substitute for what they did seek but were not allowed to have. Before anybody knew the scope of his plan, the 6 newspapers flew to arms with a vivacity that, whether it was Italian or was Greek, was in either case a fatal sign of the public temper. What, they cried, did the Treaty of 1815 mean by describing the Ionian state as free and independent? What was a protectorate, and what the rights of the protector? Was there no difference between a protector and a sovereign? What could be more arrogant and absurd than that the protector, who was not sovereign, should talk about conceding reforms to a free and independent state? All these questions were in themselves not very easy to answer, but what was a more serious obstacle than the argumentative puzzles of partisans was a want of moral and political courage, was the sycophancy of one class, and the greediness of others. 380. Constitutional reform. Closely connected with the recommendations of constitutional reform was the question by whom the necessary communications with the Assembly were to be conducted. Sir John Young was obviously impossible, though he was not at once brought to face the fact. Mr. Gladstone upon this made to the Colonial Secretary, December 27, an offer that if he had already determined on Young's recall, and if he thought reform would stand a better chance if introduced by Mr. Gladstone himself, he was willing to serve as Lord High Commissioner for the very limited time that might be necessary. We may be sure that the government lost not an hour in making up their minds on a plan that went still further both in the way of bringing Mr. Gladstone into still closer connection with them, and towards relieving themselves of a responsibility which they never from the first had any business to devolve upon Mr. Gladstone or anybody else. The answer came by telegraph, January 11, the Queen accepts. Your commission is being made out. All other embarrassments were now infinitely aggravated by the sudden discovery from the lawyers that acceptance of the new office not only vacated the seat in Parliament, but also rendered Mr. Gladstone incapable of election until he had ceased to hold the office. "This, I must confess," he told Sir Edward, "is a great blow. The difficulty and the detriment are serious." January 17. If some enemy on the meeting of the House in February should choose to move the writ for the vacant seat at Oxford, the election would necessarily take place at a date too early for the completion of the business at Corfu, and Mr. Gladstone, still at work as High Commissioner, would still therefore be ineligible. Nobody was ever by constitution more averse than Mr. Gladstone to turning backward, and in this case he felt himself especially bound to go forward not only by the logic of the Ionian situation at the moment, but for the reason which was also characteristic of him, that the Queen, in approving his appointment, January 7, had described his conduct as both patriotic and most opportune, and therefore he thought there would be unspeakable shabbiness in turning round upon her by a hurried withdrawal. The Oxford entanglement thus became almost desperate. Resolved not to disturb the settled order of proceeding with his assembly, Mr. Gladstone, with a thoroughly characteristic union of ingenuity and tenacity, tried various ways of extrication. To complete the mortifications of the position, the telegraph broke down. Question of the Oxford seat. The scrape was nearly as harassing to his friends at home as to himself. Politicians above all men can never safely count on the charity that thinks no evil. Lord John Russell told Lord Aberdeen that it was clear that Gladstone was staying away to avoid a discussion on the coming Reform Bill. There was a violent attack upon him in the Times, January 13, as having supplanted Young. The writers of leading articles looked up Greek history from the days of the visit of Ulysses to Alcinous downwards, and they mocked his respect for the countrymen of Miltiades, and his reverence for the church of Chrysostom and Athanasius. The satirists of the cleverest journal of the day admitted his greatness, the brilliance and originality of his finance, the incomparable splendor of his eloquence, and a courage equal to any undertaking, that quailed before no opposition and suffered no abatement in defeat, and they only marveled the more that a statesman of the first rank should accept at the hands of an insidious rival a fifth-rate mission, insidious rival not named but easy to identify. The fact that Mr. Gladstone had hired a house at Corfu was the foundation of a transcendent story that Mr. Disraeli wished to make him the king of the Ionian Islands. "I hardly think it needful to assure you," Mr. Gladstone told Lytton, "that I have never attached the smallest weight to any of the insinuations which it seems people have thought worthwhile to launch at some member or members of your government with respect to my mission." Though Mr. Gladstone was never by any means unconscious of the hum and buzz of paltriness and malice that often surrounds conspicuous public men, nobody was ever more regally indifferent. Graham predicted that though Gladstone would always be the first man in the House of Commons, he would not again be what he was before the Ionian business. They all thought that he would be attacked on his return. "Ah," said Aberdeen, "but he is terrible in the rebound." After much perplexity and running to and fro in London, it was arranged between the Secretary of State and Mr. Gladstone's friends, including Phillimore principally, and then Northcote and M. Bernard, that a course of proceeding should be followed, which Mr. Gladstone, when he knew it, thought unfortunate. A new commission naming a successor was issued, and Mr. Gladstone then became ipso facto liberated. Sir Henry Storks was the officer chosen, and as soon as his commission was formally received by him, he was to execute a warrant under which he deputed all powers to Mr. Gladstone until his arrival. Whether Mr. Gladstone was Lord High Commissioner when he came to propose his reform is a moot point. So intricate was the puzzle that the Under-Secretary addressed a letter to Mr. Gladstone by his name and not by the style of his official dignity, because he could not be at all sure what that official dignity really was. What is certain is that Mr. Gladstone, though it was never his way to quarrel with other people's action taken in good faith on his behalf, did not perceive the necessity for proceeding so rapidly to the appointment of his successor, and thought it decidedly injurious to such chances as his reforms might have possessed. 381. The assembly that had been convoked by Sir John Young for an extraordinary session, January 25, at once showed that its labors would bear no fruit. Mr. Gladstone as Lord High Commissioner opened the session with a message that they had met to consider proposals for reform which he desired to lay before them as soon as possible. The game began with the passing of a resolution that it was the single and unanimous will, Theta Lambda Eta Sigma Iota, of the Ionian people that the 7 islands should be united to Greece. Mr. Gladstone fought like a lion for scholars' authority to treat the word as only meaning wish or disposition, and he took for touchstone the question whether men could speak of the Theta Lambda Eta Sigma Iota of the Almighty. The word in the Lord's Prayer was found to be Theta Lambda Eta Mu Alpha. As Finlay truly says, it would have been much more to the point to accept the word as it was meant by those who used it. As to that, no mistake was possible. Some say that he ought plainly to have told them they had violated the Constitution, to have dissolved them, and above all to have stopped their pay. Instead of this, he informed them that they must put their wishes into the shape of a petition to the Queen. The idea was seized with alacrity, January 29. Oligarchs and demagogues were equally pleased to fall in with it, the former because they hoped it would throw their rivals into deeper discredit with their common master, the latter because they knew it would endear them to their constituents. Opening of the Ionian Session. The Corphiotes received the declaration of the Assembly and the address to the Queen with enthusiasm. Great crowds followed the members to their homes with joyous acclamations, all the bells of the town were set ringing, there was a grand illumination for 2 nights, and the Archbishop ordered a Te Deum. Neither Te Deums nor prayers melted the heart of the British cabinet, aware of the truth impressed at the time on Mr. Gladstone by Lytton, that neither the English public nor the English Parliament likes any policy that gives anything up. The Queen was advised to reply that she could neither consent to abandon the obligation she had undertaken, nor could permit any application from the islands to other powers in furtherance of any similar design. Then at last came the grand plan for constitutional reconstruction. Mr. Gladstone, after first stating the reply of the Queen, read an eloquent address to the Assembly, February 4, in Italian, adjuring them to reject all attempts to evade by any indirect devices the duty of pronouncing a clear and intelligible judgment on the propositions now laid before them. His appeal was useless, and it was received exactly as plans for assimilating Irish administration to English used to be. The nationalists knew that reform would be a difficulty the more in the way of separation, the retrogrades knew it would be a spoke in the wheel of their own jobbery. Mr. Gladstone professed extreme and truly characteristic astonishment in respect of the address to the Queen, that they should regard the permission to ask as identical with the promise to grant, and the right to petition as equivalent to the right to demand. If the affair had been less practically vexatious, we can imagine the Socratic satisfaction with which Mr. Gladstone would have revelled in pressing all these and many other distinctions on those who boasted of being Socrates' fellow countrymen. From day to day anxiously did Mr. Gladstone watch what he called the dodges of the Assembly. Abundant reason as there was to complain of the conduct of the Ionians in all these proceedings. It is well to record the existence of a number of sincere patriots and enlightened men like the 2 brothers Themistocles, Napoleon Zambelli, and Sir Peter Braila, afterwards Greek minister in London. This small band of royal adherents gave Mr. Gladstone all the help they could in preparing his scheme of reform, and after the scheme was launched, they strained every nerve to induce the Assembly to assent to it in spite of the pressure from the people. Their efforts were necessarily unavailing. The great majority, composed as usual of the friends of England who trembled for their own jobs, joining hands with the demagogues, was hostile to the changes proposed, and only flinched from a peremptory vote from doubt as to its reception among the people. Promptitude and force were not to be expected in either way from men in such a frame of mind. On a preliminary debate, Mr. Gladstone wrote mournfully to Phillimore, "Without any motion whatever, one man has spoken for nearly the whole of 2 days." Strong language about the proposals as cheating and fraudulent was freely used, but nothing that in Mr. Gladstone's view justified one of those high-handed prorogations after the manner of the Stuarts, that had been the usual expedient in quarrels between the High Commissioner and a recalcitrant Assembly. These doings had brought English rule over the islands to a level in the opinion of southern Europe with Austrian rule at Venice and the reign of the cardinals in the Pontifical States. Proceedings in Assembly. Sir Henry Storks arrived on the 16th of February, and the same day the Assembly, which before had been working for delay, in a great hurry gave a vote against the proposals, which, though in form preliminary, was in substance decisive. There were only 7 dissensions. Mr. Gladstone sums up the case in a private letter to Sidney Herbert.